Put that plate down and get out of the kitchen before you embarrass us all." My mother didn't look at me when she said it. She was busy adjusting the lace on my sister Claire's ivory gown, her fingers moving with a precision that felt like surgery. The air in the bridal suite smelled of expensive lilies and the sharp, chemical tang of high-end hairspray. Outside those heavy oak doors, 300 people were waiting for the social event of the season, but in here, I was just a ghost in a cheap dress. I felt my pulse thrumming against the base of my throat, a rhythmic pounding that made it hard to swallow. My palms were damp, so I wiped them against the fabric of my skirt, making sure to stay in the shadows. Claire caught my eye in the mirror and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a look of pure, filtered pity. She looked like a doll, perfect and fragile, while I felt like a crack in the foundation. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. I just stood there and felt the coldness of the marble floor through my thin soles. They wanted me gone. I'm Elena. I'm 28. And in the carefully curated gallery of my family's life, I've always been the blurry figure in the background. My age should have brought me some level of respect, or at least a seat at the table, but instead, I was the extra chair tucked away in the corner. I grew up believing that if I worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, I would eventually earn my place. I was wrong. The realization didn't come with a scream or a dramatic realization. It settled over me like a layer of fine dust. For years, I believed that love was something you could earn through loyalty. I was 28 when I finally realized that to my mother and sister, I wasn't a daughter or a sibling. I was a convenience. A safety net they were ready to cut loose. The wedding planner walked in, her heels clicking like a countdown on the polished floor. She held a clipboard with the authority of a general. She glanced at me, then back at her list, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion. She asked my mother where the sister of the bride was supposed to be seated for the reception. My mother didn't even pause her humming. She told the woman that there had been a mistake with the guest list and that I wouldn't be sitting in the main ballroom. She said it would be better if I stayed in the staff area or perhaps just left early to avoid any awkwardness with the VIP guests. She called me a burden without using the word. She said I was a distraction to the aesthetic of the evening. I watched the sunlight catch the diamond on Claire's finger, reflecting a blinding light onto the wall. They thought this moment was the pinnacle of their social climb. They thought they had finally pushed me far enough into the dark that I would disappear. They were mistaken. I'm curious if you've ever felt like a guest in your own home. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who share your DNA and realized you are completely alone? It's a strange, quiet kind of pain. If you know that feeling of being erased by the people who are supposed to see you best, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me your story in the comments. It helps to know I'm not the only one. And if you want to see how this ends, make sure you're following along. The silence in the room after my mother's instruction felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I looked at the ivory invitation on the vanity, the one I had paid for along with the rest of this lavish display. They didn't know that yet. They saw a girl who took the leftovers and thanked them for the crumbs. My mind went back to a rainy Tuesday 4 years ago. That was the day I sat in a cramped office downtown, signing the deed to the very estate we were standing in. I remembered the smell of the old ink and the way the lawyer's glasses slid down his nose. He had asked me if I wanted my family's names on the documents. I had hesitated for a single second. Then I told him no. I bought this place with the inheritance they didn't know I had. I paid for the lilies. I paid for the champagne. I even paid for the dress Claire was wearing to look down on me. I stood there, my hands gripping the edge of a mahogany table until my knuckles turned white. They were treating me like an intruder in a house I owned. It was time to stop being a ghost. I walked out of the suite and let the heavy door click shut behind me, the sound echoing through the wide, marble-floored corridor. The hallway was lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling North Gardens, where rows of white chairs were being arranged with geometric precision. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass and watched a gardener trim the edge of a hedge. He didn't know I was the one who signed his paycheck every month. My mother's words about the kitchen seating still felt like a physical weight on my chest, a dull pressure that made every breath feel intentional. It reminded me of my 10th birthday party. I remember the smell of vanilla frosting and the way the neighborhood kids laughed, but mostly I remember being told to wait in the laundry room because my dress wasn't as nice as Claire's and my mother didn't want the photos ruined by a mismatched child. I sat on a basket of dirty towels for 3 hours. I was forgotten. The venue was humming with the frantic energy of a high-stakes performance. Waiters in crisp black vests moved like schools of fish, carrying silver trays and adjusted centerpieces that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. I recognized the lead florist, a woman named Sarah who had spent weeks emailing me about the specific shade of cream for the roses. She walked past me now, her eyes scanning the room for perfection, and didn't give me a second glance. To her, I was just another staff member, or perhaps a distant, unimportant relative. My family had insisted on keeping my name off all the contracts, claiming it was for legal protection, but I knew the truth. They wanted to pretend this wealth was theirs. They wanted to own the stage without acknowledging who built it. I felt a sharp pang of irritation, a heat that started in my stomach and rose to my cheeks. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, counting to 4 as the air filled my lungs. I am the foundation. I moved toward the grand ballroom, the space where the reception would take place later that evening. The gold leaf detailing on the ceiling glittered under the massive crystal chandeliers I had commissioned from a workshop in Italy. Every inch of this place was a reflection of my taste and my quiet, steady labor. I stopped at table 42, tucked away near the swinging doors of the industrial kitchen. There it was. A single, lonely place setting with a handwritten card that simply said Elena. No last name. No fancy calligraphy. Just a plain white card on a table meant for the vendors and the backup photographers. The injustice of it felt like a cold needle. I remembered the night I graduated from university with honors. I had cooked a 3-course meal for the family to celebrate, but they never showed up because Claire had a minor fashion emergency before a party. I ate that dinner alone at the kitchen counter. I cleaned the plates. My father appeared at the end of the hall, looking uncomfortable in a tuxedo that was slightly too tight around the waist. He was checking his watch every 30 seconds, a nervous habit he'd had since I was a child. When he saw me standing by the kitchen table, he didn't look angry, he just looked tired. He walked over and patted my shoulder, but his eyes were darting around to see if anyone was watching us. He told me it was just for the best, that the seating was tight and Claire's new in-laws were very particular about who sat in the front rows. He said I understood, didn't I? He didn't wait for an answer. He never did. He just straightened his tie and walked away toward the VIP lounge where the champagne was already flowing. He was a coward. I sat down in the chair at table 42. The fabric was rougher than the velvet chairs at the front of the room. I looked at the menu tucked into the napkin and saw that the guest choices were filet mignon or lobster tail. Underneath, in small, cramped print, the staff meal was listed as a chicken salad wrap. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, but I choked it back. The absurdity of it was almost poetic. They were planning to feed the owner of the estate a wrap from a plastic container while they toasted to a life of luxury I had provided. I reached into my small clutch bag and felt the weight of the master key card and the legal documents I had tucked inside. My heart began to race, a frantic drumming against my ribs that I could feel in the tips of my fingers. I was shaking. I stood up and walked toward the main entrance just as the first fleet of black town cars began to pull up the long, gravel driveway. These were the power players of the city, the people my mother had spent decades trying to impress. They stepped out onto the red carpet I had paid for, their silk dresses and custom suits catching the late afternoon sun. I saw the groom's father, a man with a reputation for being ruthless in business, stepping out of a Bentley. My mother was already there, her face transformed into a mask of gracious hospitality. She looked like she belonged there. She acted like she owned the world. I watched her greet him with a practiced laugh, gesturing toward the estate as if it were an ancestral home she had inherited through blood and tradition rather than a property her daughter bought with a secret windfall. She was lying. I stayed in the shadows of the stone pillars, watching the spectacle unfold. I thought about the bank statements sitting in my desk drawer at home and the way my mother had looked at me earlier in the suite. She truly believed I was nothing. She believed that because I didn't scream or demand attention, I had no power. It's a common mistake people make about the quiet ones. They think the silence is a void, but usually it's a reservoir. I felt a sudden, strange sense of calm wash over me, replacing the shaking in my hands. The heat in my chest didn't go away, but it settled into a steady, glowing coal. I wasn't going to hide in the kitchen. I wasn't going to be the girl in the laundry room again. The ceremony was about to begin, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and anticipation. They wanted a show. I would give them one. The music began, a swell of strings that I had personally auditioned months ago. I stood behind a towering topiary, the waxy leaves brushing against my shoulder as the wedding march echoed through the gardens. It was a Debussy arrangement, delicate and ethereal, exactly what Claire had demanded without knowing the name of the composer. I watched her emerge from the manor, her ivory veil trailing behind her like a captured mist. She looked like a dream, the kind of perfection that costs 6 figures to manufacture. Beside her, my father walked with a stiff, practiced dignity, his chin tilted just high enough to suggest a lineage he didn't actually possess. The guests rose in a single, fluid motion, a sea of silk and tailored wool. I felt the vibration of the music in the soles of my feet. It was a beautiful lie. The altar was a masterpiece of white marble and cascading wisteria. I remembered the day the contractor called me in a panic because the stone had arrived with a hairline fracture. I had been in the middle of a high-stakes board meeting for my tech firm, but I stepped out to authorize the immediate replacement of the entire slab. I had paid for that perfection. Now, I watched Marcus, the groom, take Claire's hand. He came from a family of old, stale money, the kind that looked down on anyone who actually had to work for their wealth. He looked at Claire with a mix of pride and possession, convinced he was marrying into a dynasty equal to his own. My mother sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She was performing the role of the grieving yet proud matriarch with the skill of a seasoned actress. She looked like she belonged there. She acted like every blade of grass on this estate was her birthright. As the officiant began to speak about the sanctity of family and the merging of 2 great houses, my mind drifted back to a winter evening 6 years ago. It was the night I had landed my first major investment contract, the one that paved the way for the fortune I now held. I had come home late, cold and exhausted, but vibrating with the thrill of success. The house was glowing with light, and I could hear the clinking of silverware from the dining room. They were having a celebratory dinner for Claire because she had been featured in a local fashion blog. There was no place set for me. When I tried to tell them about my contract, my mother didn't even look up from her wine glass. She told me to be quiet because I was interrupting Claire's story about a shoe sale. I stood in the doorway, my coat still damp from the sleet, and watched them toast to a blog post while I held the future of their entire lifestyle in my hands. I went upstairs and ate a protein bar in the dark. That was the day I realized that my value to them was inversely proportional to my achievements. The vows were a series of hollow promises. Marcus spoke of honesty and partnership, his voice carrying clearly over the silent crowd. Claire replied with words of devotion that I knew she had copied from a celebrity wedding transcript. I looked down at my hands, resting on the rough bark of the hedge. My nails were short and unpolished, a stark contrast to the manicured elegance of the women in the front rows. I was the labor that allowed them to be the leisure. I felt the weight of the master key card in my pocket, a small piece of plastic that held the power to lock every door in this mansion and turn off the very air they were breathing. I could have ended it right then. I didn't. I just waited. A late arriving guest, a woman dripping in gold jewelry and smelling of aggressive sandalwood, hurried past my hiding spot. She stopped and looked at me with a sharp, impatient frown. She asked me where the restrooms were, gesturing vaguely toward the house as if I were a piece of the architecture. I pointed the way, my voice low and steady, but she didn't bother to say thank you. She treated me with the same casual dismissal she would show a servant or a stray cat. I watched her walk away, her designer heels sinking into the soft turf I had paid to have professionally leveled. It was a small moment, but it solidified the cold, hard lump of resolve in my stomach. The invisibility was finally complete. The ceremony ended with a kiss that looked like it had been choreographed for a magazine cover. The crowd erupted into applause, and the string quartet shifted into something upbeat and modern. As the guests began to migrate toward the terrace for cocktails, I moved through the shadows of the stone pillars. I watched my mother laughing with the senator's wife, her hand resting on the woman's arm as if they were lifelong friends. My mother had spent decades clawing her way toward the social peak, and today she felt she had arrived. She had no idea that the ground beneath her feet was mine. She had no idea that the very roof over her head was held up by the daughter she had just tried to hide in the kitchen. I walked toward the side entrance of the ballroom, avoiding the main flow of the crowd. I needed to see the reception area before the madness began. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the space where I was supposedly meant to eat a chicken wrap at table 42. The room was breathtaking. The crystal chandeliers I had commissioned from Venice were glowing with a warm, amber light, reflecting off thousands of hand-cut facets. The tables were set with silver and fine bone china. At the far end of the room, table 42 sat near the service entrance, its plain white card standing out like a bruise on a peach. I walked over and picked up the card. My name was written in my mother's hurried, careless script. Just Elena. No title. No respect. I tore the card into 4 neat pieces and let them flutter to the floor. I looked at the head table, an elevated platform draped in silk and topped with massive arrangements of white orchids. That was where my family would sit, looking down on the people they had invited to witness their triumph. I felt a strange, detached sense of calm. The anger was there, but it was quiet now, a steady hum in the background of my mind. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. Inside were the eviction notices and the property transfer documents, all signed and notarized. I had originally intended to wait until after the honeymoon to serve them, but the kitchen seating had changed my mind. They wanted a public spectacle of their success. I was going to give them a public lesson in ownership. A waiter entered from the kitchen, carrying a tray of appetizers. He saw me standing there and hesitated, likely wondering if I was a guest who had wandered off or a staff member out of uniform. I looked him in the eye and told him to make sure the champagne was chilled to exactly 44 degrees. He blinked, surprised by the authority in my voice, and nodded quickly before scurrying away. I realized then that I had been playing the part of the victim for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to lead. My heart was a steady, rhythmic thud. The shaking in my hands had completely vanished. I was no longer the girl in the laundry room. I checked the time. The cocktail hour would be over in 20 minutes. The grand entrance was scheduled for 6 o'clock. I walked back toward the VIP lounge, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. I saw my father through the glass doors, nursing a scotch and looking at his reflection in a gilded mirror. He looked old. He looked like a man who had sold his soul for a comfortable chair and a high-status invitation. I didn't hate him. I just didn't recognize him anymore. I turned away and headed for the main security office near the front gates. It was time to talk to the head of my private security detail. It was time to change the locks. The security office was tucked away in the basement, a bunker of concrete and humming servers that felt a world away from the silk-draped opulence upstairs. The air here was thin and smelled of ozone and industrial-grade floor wax. I stepped inside, the heavy steel door thudding shut behind me, cutting off the distant, muffled strains of the quartet. Mr. Henderson, a man who had spent 20 years in high-stakes private protection before I hired him, stood up immediately. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He didn't treat me like a child or a nuisance. He looked at me with the steady, professional gaze of a man who knew exactly who signed the checks. I saw my own reflection in the wall of monitors behind him, 64 glowing squares of light capturing every angle of my family's masquerade. I looked small in the center of the room. I felt lethal. I leaned over the console, my eyes scanning the screens. On monitor 4, I saw my mother in the VIP lounge, her head tilted back in a theatrical laugh as she accepted a glass of vintage Cristal from a waiter. On monitor 12, Claire was sitting at her vanity, her face a mask of cold calculation as she touched up her lipstick, her eyes narrowed at a bridesmaid who was struggling with a steamer. They looked like characters in a play I had written but had no part in. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of a summer 8 years ago, the year they decided to rent a house in the Hamptons. I had worked 3 jobs that summer to pay for my final year of tuition, but when I showed up at the gate with my single suitcase, my mother told me through the intercom that there simply wasn't enough room. She said the guest rooms were reserved for Claire's influential friends from school. I spent that night sleeping in the back seat of my gray Honda in a public parking lot 3 miles away, watching the fireworks from their beach party reflect in the rearview mirror. I woke up with a cramped neck and a heart turned to stone. I never forgot the sound of that intercom clicking off. I turned to Henderson and handed him the leather-bound folder. My fingers were cold, the tips almost numb, but my grip was firm. I told him that at exactly 6:15 p.m., the perimeter gates were to be locked and all valet services suspended. I instructed him to have his team stationed at every exit of the ballroom, not as guards, but as witnesses. He nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement. He asked if I wanted the local authorities notified or if I preferred to handle the initial service of papers myself. I told him I would handle the announcement. I wanted to see the exact moment the light went out of my mother's eyes. I wanted to be the last thing she saw before her carefully constructed world collapsed into the dirt. I felt a throb in my temple. My jaw ached. I left the security room and began the long climb back to the main level. Instead of taking the grand staircase, I used the service elevator, the one the catering staff used to transport the heavy silver warming trays. It was small and cramped, the walls scratched from years of use. I stood in the corner, watching the floor numbers glow and fade. I thought about the kitchen seating again. It was such a small, petty act of cruelty, the kind of thing they did without even thinking, like swatting a fly. They didn't realize that even the smallest weight can break a bridge if it's placed on a structural crack. They had been piling weights on me for 28 years. Today, the bridge was coming down. The elevator opened into the service corridor behind the ballroom. The heat was intense here, a thick wall of steam, and the smell of roasted garlic and expensive oils. Chefs were shouting orders, their white hats bobbing as they plated the first course with trembling precision. I moved through them like a ghost, unnoticed in the chaos. I reached the swinging doors that led to the dining area and paused, my hand hovering over the wood. I could hear the roar of the crowd now, the sound of 300 people talking and laughing, the clink of silverware against china, the collective hum of high society. It was a beautiful, expensive noise. I pushed the door open just a crack. The room was a sea of candlelight and gold. The guests had all taken their seats, a tapestry of shimmering fabrics and polished skin. At the far end, Table 42 sat in the shadows of the service entrance. My chair was still empty. I saw the pieces of my name card on the floor, white confetti against the dark carpet. I walked toward it, keeping my head down, my heart performing a frantic, irregular rhythm in my chest. I felt like I was walking into a firing squad, but I was the one holding the ammunition. I sat down in the hard, wooden chair and adjusted the napkin in my lap. The table was small, the linen slightly frayed at the edge. A waiter, his face flushed from the heat of the kitchen, set a plastic container in front of me. It was the chicken wrap. He looked at me with a flash of genuine apology before moving on to the next table. I didn't touch it. I just looked at the head table, the throne where my family would soon be seated. I looked at my watch. 6:05 p.m. In 10 minutes, the doors would open and the royal family would make their entrance. I could see the wedding planner near the main doors, her headset glowing as she coordinated the timing with the DJ. She looked stressed, her eyes darting around the room to ensure every candle was lit and every fork was aligned. She didn't look at table 42. No one did. I felt a strange, cold peace settle over me, a stillness that was almost physical. It reminded me of the time I had to put down my old golden retriever, Barnaby, because my father refused to pay the vet bill and told me it was a waste of resources for an old dog. I had stayed with Barnaby in the cold garage, his head in my lap, and I had promised him that one day I would be the one who decided what was a waste and what was worth keeping. I was keeping that promise now. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, and a spotlight hit the grand entrance. The DJ's voice boomed over the speakers, filled with a manufactured excitement that set my teeth on edge. He announced the arrival of the new Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Sterling. The double doors swung open, and there they were. Claire was radiant, her veil billowing in the artificial breeze of the air conditioning, her hand tucked into Marcus's arm with a grip that looked like a permanent weld. Behind them followed my mother and father, their faces glowing with a mixture of pride and relief. They had done it. They had secured the alliance. They had sold the family name for a seat at the big table. They were walking toward the platform, waving to the cheering crowd like they were visiting dignitaries. I stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate. I didn't make a sound, but I felt the shift in the air around me. I tucked the leather folder under my arm and began to walk toward the center of the room. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for the microphone at the edge of the dance floor. I saw my mother's eyes catch mine across the room. She frowned, her lips thinning into a line of pure annoyance. She made a subtle shooing motion with her hand, signaling me to go back to the shadows. She thought I was making a mistake. She thought I was having a breakdown. I reached the microphone and felt the cold metal of the stand under my hand. The feedback was a sharp, piercing whistle that cut through the music like a knife. The room went silent. Every head turned. My mother's face went from annoyance to a pale, sickly white. She froze in her tracks, her hand still raised in that dismissive wave. Claire stopped at the edge of the platform, her bouquet trembling in her hand. Marcus looked confused, his brow furrowing as he tried to figure out who this woman in the plain dress was and why she was interrupting his moment. I looked out at the 300 faces, the cream of society, the people who had ignored me all night. I felt the weight of the house above us, the thousands of tons of stone and steel that I owned. I felt the master key in my pocket. My voice, when it finally came, was clear and steady, vibrating with a power I hadn't known I possessed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just spoke the truth into the silence. I tapped the microphone. The sound was a sharp, electronic crack that echoed off the vaulted ceilings and cut through the polite murmurs like a blade. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a landslide. I looked out at the sea of faces, a blur of sequins and starched collars, but my focus was locked on the head table. My mother had frozen mid-stride, her hand still clutching a glass of champagne that suddenly looked too heavy for her to hold. Claire was a pale ghost in her white silk, her eyes wide and dark with a mounting, frantic confusion. They were waiting for me to apologize, to stumble, to be the clumsy girl they had spent a lifetime refining into a shadow. I felt the cool metal of the microphone stand beneath my fingers, a grounding force against the frantic drumming of my heart. My pulse was a rhythmic throb in my ears. I didn't blink. I'd like to thank you all for being here to witness such a significant transition, I said. My voice was calm, a steady, melodic hum that carried to the furthest corners of the ballroom. I told them it was a beautiful evening, a perfect display of the Sterling family's legacy. I saw my mother's chest rise in a shallow, jagged breath. She thought I was playing along. She thought I was finally giving her the tribute she felt she deserved. I watched a single bead of sweat roll down my father's temple, carving a path through his expensive foundation. He knew. He was the only one who had seen the look in my eyes when I walked past table 42. He knew the bridge was already gone. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of my 14th Christmas. I had saved my allowance for an entire year to buy my mother a hand-carved locket, a small thing, but the most expensive gift I could afford. She had opened it, glanced at it for a second, and then handed it to Claire, saying it would look better with Claire's complexion. I spent the rest of the night in the pantry, counting the cans of soup so I wouldn't have to hear them laughing in the living room. I was the ghost in the pantry then. Now, I was the light. It's truly a shame that the hosts of this evening didn't find the time to properly introduce the woman who actually provided this venue, I continued. I saw Marcus's father, the man who built his reputation on ruthless acquisitions, lean forward with a look of predatory interest. I looked him in the eye and told the room that they were currently standing on property owned entirely by a holding company they had never heard of. I told them the champagne they were drinking, the flowers they were admiring, and even the dress my sister was wearing were paid for by that same company. I watched the color drain from Claire's face until she matched the ivory of her gown. She looked like a wax figure melting under a spotlight. I reached into my folder and pulled out the deed, the gold seal of the notary catching the light from the chandeliers I had bought. I held it up. It was just a piece of paper, but in this room, it was a weapon. They were silent. My mother finally found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing that barely carried past the first row. She told me I was being hysterical. She told the guests that I had been under a great deal of stress and that the family would handle my episode privately. She took a step toward the platform, her eyes burning with a cold, desperate fury that would have terrified me 6 months ago. She reached for the microphone, her fingers hooked like talons. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I let her get close enough to smell the expensive lilies on her breath. I looked her in the eyes and whispered, just loud enough for the mic to catch it, that she should check her purse. I told her the eviction notice for the family estate, the one she thought she still owned, had been delivered to her seat 10 minutes ago. She stopped. She looked like she had been struck. The room erupted. It wasn't a loud noise, but a frantic, buzzing swarm of whispers that filled the air like static. People were leaning in, their faces contorted with the thrill of a scandal they could dine on for months. I saw Marcus's father turn to his son with a look of pure, unadulterated rage. The alliance was crumbling in real time. I felt a strange, detached sense of satisfaction, a cold click in my chest where the pain used to be. It was like finishing a complex puzzle and realizing the final picture was exactly what I expected. I wasn't the burden. I wasn't the distraction. I was the owner. I felt the air in the room grow thin. Henderson and his team moved into position at the exits, their dark suits a stark contrast to the colorful gowns of the guests. They didn't have to say a word. Their presence alone changed the temperature of the room. I looked at table 42, the small, lonely station near the kitchen where they had tried to bury me. It looked ridiculous now, a tiny, petty insult in the face of the truth. I remembered the way the wedding planner had looked at me earlier, her eyes scanning over me as if I were a smudge on the glass. I looked at her now. She was holding her clipboard to her chest like a shield, her mouth hanging open in a perfect circle of shock. She finally saw me. Everyone did. I looked at my sister, who was clutching her bouquet so hard the white orchids were beginning to bruise and weep. She had spent her whole life being the prize, the one who was polished and presented while I was hidden away like a shameful secret. She was realizing that the pedestal she was standing on was made of my money and my mercy. And the mercy was gone. I told the room that the reception was officially over. I told them the valet would be returning their cars in order of their social importance, starting from the back of the room and working toward the front. It was a petty move. I didn't care. I watched the VIPs in the front row stiffen, their faces turning various shades of purple and red. They were being told to wait. They were being treated like I had been treated for 28 years. It felt like justice. It felt like breath.My father stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the marble. He looked at me with a mix of shame and something that might have been pride if he weren't so terrified of his wife. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the floor, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the ceiling was finally pressing down on him. I felt a fleeting, sharp pang of regret for him, but it vanished as soon as it appeared. He had watched them erase me for decades and had never once picked up a pen to write my name back in. He was a silent partner in my disappearance. Now he was a silent partner in his own downfall. I turned back to the microphone. The hum of the crowd was getting louder, a chaotic roar of questions and accusations. I had one more thing to say. I waited for the peak of the noise, then let the silence fall again. I was in control. I didn't wait for them to recover. I stepped down from the platform, the low-profile heels of my shoes clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the marble that I had chosen and paid for 3 years ago. I remember the day I picked this specific stone. I was 25, sitting in a dusty warehouse in Carrara, Italy, while my mother was blowing through my secret savings to buy Claire a convertible she didn't know how to drive. I had spent 6 hours looking at slabs, looking for the one that wouldn't crack under pressure. I found it. I was walking on it now. I looked at the guests as I passed, and for the first time, the invisibility felt like a cloak of armor rather than a shroud of shame. I felt the heat of their stares, a physical pressure against my skin, but I didn't falter. I was the architect of this moment. Marcus's father, a man whose name was synonymous with old-world cruelty and brand-name dominance, moved first. He didn't go to comfort his son or his new daughter-in-law. He didn't even look at my mother, who was still gasping for air like a fish out of water. He walked directly toward me, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. He was a man who understood power dynamics with the instinct of a shark. He stopped 3 feet away, his eyes scanning my face, looking for a crack, a tremor, or a hint of bluff. He asked me if the documents were authentic. I didn't answer with words. I simply reached into my folder and handed him a certified copy of the property title and the incorporation papers of the holding company. He took them with a hand that didn't shake. He read them with the speed of a man used to signing death warrants for smaller businesses. His face didn't change, but I saw his grip tighten on the paper. He turned to Marcus, who was standing frozen on the stage, and told him the wedding was over. He said it with the casual finality of a waiter announcing they were out of the daily special. He told Marcus to get his things and leave. The social alliance hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated. I remember a winter gala 6 years ago, a night when the temperature dropped so low the fountains in the square froze into jagged statues of ice. I had worked for 18 hours straight on a project that would eventually fund this very estate, but when I arrived at the venue, my mother met me at the door. She told me my coat was too bulky and my face looked tired, and that it would be better for the family's image if I stayed in the car and caught up on my sleep. She said I was the intellectual one and that I didn't need the spotlight like Claire did. I sat in that freezing car for 5 hours, my breath fogging the windows, watching them through the glass doors as they laughed and danced with the city's elite. I was the shadow they kept in the trunk. I felt that same cold now, but this time, I was the one standing in the light. My mother finally broke her silence. It wasn't a scream, but a high, thin whistle of a sound, like steam escaping a pressurized valve. She rushed toward me, her silk dress rustling with a frantic, desperate energy. She tried to grab my arm, her manicured nails digging into the sleeve of my dress, but I stepped back, and she stumbled. She called me a monster. She told me I had ruined everything she had worked for. She didn't mention love. She didn't mention the family. She mentioned the reputation. She mentioned the years she had spent climbing a ladder that I had just kicked out from under her. I looked at her and felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. I told her that she hadn't worked for any of this. I told her that she had lived on the labor of a daughter she tried to bury. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. She was finally showing me her true face. It was a relief. Claire began to cry. It was an ugly, jagged sound that ripped through the remains of the music. She was sitting on the edge of the elevated platform, her ivory veil tangled in the floral arrangements, looking like a discarded doll. She looked at Marcus, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. He was busy following his father toward the exit, his head down, his role as the prince of the evening revoked in an instant. Claire turned to me, her face wet with tears and black streaks of mascara. She asked me why I would do this to her on her special day. She said it was her moment. I felt a sharp, sudden memory of my college graduation. I had graduated at the top of my class, but Claire had staged a fake breakup with a boyfriend that morning, and the entire family spent the day consoling her. No one came to my ceremony. I walked across that stage alone, listening to the silence where my family's applause should have been. I looked at her now and told her that every day of her life had been a special day at my expense. I told her the bill had finally come due. The room was a chaotic hive of activity. Guests were scrambling for their belongings, the air thick with the sound of zippers closing and frantic whispers. They were terrified of being associated with a family that had just been publicly gutted. I watched the VIPs, the women who had ignored my existence for a decade, hurry toward the doors, their faces shielded by their hands as if the scandal were contagious. Henderson stood by the main exit, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence a silent reminder that the gates would be locked in exactly 10 minutes. He caught my eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He was my wall. I was the keep. I walked toward the long, white-clothed table where the wedding cake stood, a 5-tier monstrosity of sugar and lace that had cost more than my first car. I picked up a silver dessert fork and took a small, deliberate bite of the frosting. It was cloyingly sweet, an artificial flavor that left a bitter aftertaste on the back of my tongue. It was exactly what I expected. I looked at my father, who was sitting at a nearby table, his head in his hands. He hadn't moved since the announcement. He looked small. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was a secondary character in his own life. I walked over and placed the folder on the table in front of him. I told him he had 24 hours to pack his things. I told him I had already arranged for a small apartment downtown, a place with 1 bedroom and no view. It was more than he had given me when I started my business. He didn't look up. He just nodded, a slow, heavy movement that made him look 100 years old. The lights in the ballroom flickered once, then twice, a signal from the security team that the power was about to be cut to the non-essential areas. The golden glow of the chandeliers began to dim, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of exhaustion, a weight in my limbs that made it hard to stand. I had been holding my breath for 10 years, and now that I was finally breathing, my lungs ached. I looked at the wreckage of the evening, the overturned chairs, the discarded flowers, the half-empty glasses of champagne. It was a beautiful disaster. I felt a drip of something cold on my hand and realized I was sweating. My heart was still racing, a frantic, uneven beat that felt like a bird trapped in a cage. I wasn't happy. I wasn't sad. I was just stunned. I turned and walked toward the back of the room, toward the service entrance. I didn't want to leave through the front doors. I didn't want to see the flashing lights of the cars or the confused faces of the staff. I wanted the quiet of the kitchen. I pushed through the swinging doors and was met with the smell of cold grease and dish soap. The catering staff was standing there, their faces a mix of awe and terror. They had heard everything. I looked at the head chef, a man who had spent the last 6 hours preparing a feast that would never be eaten. I told him to pack up the food and give it to the local shelters. I told him to make sure nothing went to waste. He nodded, his eyes wide, and began to bark orders at his team. Even in the middle of a collapse, the work continued. I found a small, wooden stool in the corner of the pantry and sat down. My legs were shaking. I looked at my hands, the fingers pale and thin, and realized I was still holding the silver fork. I set it down on a stack of clean towels. I remember a time when I was 8 years old, and I had broken a vase in the living room. My mother had made me sit in the dark for 3 hours to reflect on my clumsiness. I remember the way the shadows moved on the walls, and the way I had promised myself that one day I would own the light. I looked around the pantry now. It was small and cramped, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I could stay here as long as I wanted. No one was going to tell me to move. No one was going to tell me I didn't fit the image. I was the image. The silence of the house began to settle in, a deep, heavy quiet that swallowed the last echoes of the chaos. The guests were gone. The music had stopped. My family was somewhere upstairs, packing their lives into suitcases they hadn't paid for. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the industrial refrigerators. It was a lonely sound, but it was steady. It was honest. I thought about the next day and the day after that. I thought about the meetings I had scheduled and the projects I had in the pipeline. My life wasn't going to change, not really. I would still be the one who worked while others played. I would still be the one who looked at the foundation while others looked at the paint. But the difference was that now everyone knew it. The invisibility was gone. And in its place was something much heavier. Responsibility. I stood up, smoothed the fabric of my dress, and prepared to walk back out into the dark. I had a lot of work to do. I stood up from the stool, the wood groaning under my weight in a way that felt like a long, tired sigh. The kitchen was a tomb of stainless steel and discarded dreams, smelling of cold grease and the sharp, floral ghost of the centerpieces. I walked back into the main hallway, where the silence was so thick it felt like walking through water. The chandeliers were dim, glowing with a ghostly, low-voltage hum that barely touched the corners of the vaulted ceiling. I saw a single white rose petal on the floor, crushed and turning brown at the edges. It was a casualty of the exit. A small death. I stepped over it without a second thought. I headed toward the grand staircase, my hand trailing along the mahogany banister. I remembered the day this banister was installed. I was 24, and I had spent 4 hours arguing with the carpenter about the exact curve of the wood because I wanted it to feel welcoming under a hand. I wanted it to feel like a home that held you up. Now, it just felt like a cold, expensive barrier between me and the people I used to call family. As I reached the second floor, the air changed. It was filled with the sound of drawers slamming and the frantic, rhythmic rustle of tissue paper. My mother's bedroom door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out onto the carpet. I stopped. I could see her through the gap, her hair disheveled for the first time in my life, shoving silk blouses into a suitcase with a violence that made her breathe in short, sharp gasps. She looked older than she had an hour ago. She looked small. I leaned against the door frame and felt a sudden, sharp memory of a summer when I was 12, the year we stayed at the lake house. I had found an old film camera in the attic and spent the whole week taking pictures of the dragonflies and the way the orange sunset hit the water like a liquid fire. When I showed the photos to my mother, she didn't even look at the prints. She told me I was wasting film on bugs and that I should be more like Claire, who was spending her time learning how to host a proper tea party for the neighbors. She took the camera from my hands and gave it to Claire the next day. Claire dropped it in the lake within an hour. I watched it sink, the silver casing glinting one last time before it vanished into the dark muck. My mother didn't apologize. She just told me I shouldn't have been so careless as to leave it where Claire could reach it. I stood in the hallway now and realized that my entire life had been a series of cameras being dropped into lakes. I wasn't going to let them drop this house. Never again. My mother saw me in the doorway. She stopped mid-motion, a designer scarf dangling from her hand like a dead silk bird. Her eyes were red, the skin around them tight and bruised, looking from the stress of the evening. She didn't scream this time. Her voice was a low, jagged whisper that sounded like dry leaves scraping on pavement. She asked me if I was happy now. She asked if this was what I wanted, to see my family on the street like common beggars. I told her they weren't on the street. I told her they had an apartment downtown, a place I had paid for out of a sense of obligation I probably shouldn't have. I told her they had exactly what they had earned. She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed off the high ceilings and made my skin crawl. She said I was cold. She said I was a monster they had raised in their own nest. I felt a sharp, sudden thrum in my ears, a vibration of anger that I had to fight to keep under control. My fingers curled into my palms. I stayed still. I told her that coldness was a learned behavior, a survival instinct she had perfected in me. I reminded her of the nights I spent working in the freezing garage because she didn't want the light from my office to ruin the aesthetic of her dinner parties. I reminded her of the birthdays where my only gift was a contribution to Claire's debutante wardrobe. She looked away, her jaw tightening until I could see the muscles jumping in her cheek. She didn't have an answer because there was no answer to the truth. She went back to her packing, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the grace she had cultivated for decades falling away in chunks. I watched her for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. I had no more words for her. The silence was the only thing I had left to give. I walked down the long gallery toward the east wing, my footsteps muffled by the thick, hand-woven rugs. This was the part of the house they rarely used, the section I had kept for myself as a sanctuary. I opened the door to my study, a room filled with books and the quiet, comforting hum of my workstation. It smelled of old paper and the expensive, smoky tea I liked to drink while I worked late into the night. I sat down in my chair and looked at the monitors. The security feed showed the last of the catering vans driving away, their red taillights fading into the darkness of the long driveway. The estate was becoming a fortress again. I felt the weight of the key card in my pocket, a small, cold piece of plastic that represented every hour of labor and every insult I had swallowed. I was the master of this house. I thought about the legal battle that had led to this moment. It hadn't been a quick process. It was a slow, deliberate siege. It had taken 3 years of careful maneuvering, of buying up the family's debt through third-party collectors and shifting assets through shell companies that my father wasn't smart enough to track. I had watched them spend money they didn't have, waiting for the exact moment when the debt finally outweighed the ego. That moment had come 6 months ago. I had stepped in as the anonymous buyer, the savior of the family legacy they had been too lazy to protect. They had signed the papers with smiles on their faces, thinking they were getting a fresh start. They didn't realize they were signing their own eviction notices. I was the trap they had built for themselves. I was the consequence. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness, a hollow space in my chest that the victory couldn't quite fill. I had won the house, but I had lost the family I never really had in the first place. I looked at a photograph on my desk, a small, faded picture of me as a toddler, sitting on my father's shoulders. We both looked happy, or at least, we looked like we were pretending to be. I wondered if that man still existed somewhere inside the shell of the person upstairs. Probably not. The greed had eaten him from the inside out years ago, leaving nothing but a tuxedo and a nervous habit of checking his watch to see how much time he had left before the next crisis. I turned the photo face down. I didn't need the ghosts watching me. I walked back out to the internal balcony that overlooked the ballroom. The staff was moving efficiently now, clearing away the wreckage of the party under the watchful eye of Henderson's team. The white lilies were being piled into black plastic trash bags, their scent turning from sweet to sickly as they began to wilt in the heat. I saw the wedding cake being wheeled away, a 5-tier mountain of sugar that no one wanted to touch. It looked like a monument to a forgotten civilization, something grand and useless. I watched them work, their movements silent and practiced. They knew the rules of the new regime. They knew who was in charge now. I felt a sense of order returning to the world, a mechanical, cold precision that I found comforting. The chaos was over. The maintenance was beginning. I saw Claire in the gardens through the tall windows. She was still in her wedding dress, the lace hem dragging through the damp, muddy grass like a broken wing. She was sitting on a stone bench, her head in her hands, looking like a discarded ghost. I wondered if she was thinking about Marcus and the life she had lost, or if she was thinking about the bank accounts that were now empty. Probably the money. She had never known a world where comfort wasn't a given, where effort was required for survival. She was about to learn the hard way. I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt a strange, detached curiosity, like a scientist watching an experiment enter its final, inevitable phase. She would survive. People like her always found a new host to cling to. I went back to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee. The black liquid was hot and bitter, a sharp contrast to the cloying frosting I had tasted earlier. I leaned against the cold marble counter and watched the digital clock on the oven. It was nearly midnight. In 12 hours, the locks would be changed. In 24 hours, the moving trucks would arrive to take the last of their vanity away. The transition would be complete. I felt a sudden, sharp burst of energy, a clarity of purpose that made my heart skip a beat. I wasn't just defending a house. I was reclaiming a life that had been stolen from me one small piece at a time. I was the girl who had been buried in the laundry room, and now I was the one who owned the foundation. I was the one who decided who stayed. I was the one who set the table. I finished my coffee and set the mug in the sink. The clink of ceramic against stainless steel was the loudest sound in the house. I walked back to the service elevator and pressed the button for the basement. I wanted to see Henderson one last time before I closed my eyes. I wanted to make sure the perimeter was secure and that no one could get in. And more importantly, I wanted to be sure that the people inside knew they were already out. I was the owner. I was the law. I was the ghost who had finally come home. The elevator door opened, and I stepped out into the cool, pressurized air of the security hub. Henderson was still there, his eyes fixed on the grid of monitors. He didn't look tired. He looked ready for the next shift. I told him to keep the gates locked until morning and to call me if a single soul tried to cross the line. He nodded once, a sharp, professional gesture that I appreciated more than any of the flowery praise I had heard tonight. He was a man who understood the value of a job well done. I turned to leave, but he stopped me with a quiet word. He asked me if I was okay. I looked at him and realized he was the only person in this entire estate who had bothered to ask that question in a decade. I told him I was fine. I told him I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I walked back to the elevator and felt the doors close, sealing me into the quiet, dark heart of my kingdom. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The sheets were silk, the pillows were down, and the view of the valley was spectacular. But as I lay back and closed my eyes, I didn't think about the luxury or the power. I thought about the girl in the laundry room. I thought about the girl who ate a protein bar in the dark on graduation night. I thought about the girl who wasn't allowed in the family photos because her dress was wrong. I whispered to her that it was over. I told her we won. And then, for the first time in years, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I was safe. I was home. I was alone. It was perfect. I woke up to the sound of a bird chirping on the stone ledge outside my window. The sun was rising over the ridge, casting a golden, forgiving light across the room that made everything look soft and new. I sat up and felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt since I was a child. The shaking in my hands was gone. The anger had settled into a steady, useful coal. There was only the future now. I walked to the window and looked out at the estate as the mist began to rise off the grass. It was a beautiful day for a change. I saw a moving truck pull into the driveway, its headlights dim in the morning light. It was time for the final act. I dressed quickly in a pair of dark trousers and a simple sweater, choosing clothes that were functional rather than fashionable. I was a woman of business now. I was a woman of action. I went down to the front hall and watched as the movers began to carry the first of the boxes out of the house. My mother was standing by the door, her face a mask of cold, silent fury. She didn't look at me as I passed, and I didn't look at her. My father was helping the movers, his face red and sweaty, looking more like a hired laborer than the gentleman he pretended to be. He looked up and saw me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been regret, or maybe just exhaustion. Whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. He went back to his boxes. I walked out onto the porch and breathed in the fresh, cool air of the morning. The world was changing. And I was the one who had changed it. I was the girl in the kitchen. And now, the kitchen was mine. I watched the last of the trucks pull away, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. The house was finally empty of their noise. The family was gone. I was the only one left. I walked back inside and closed the heavy oak doors, the sound of the latch clicking shut echoing through the silent, cavernous hall. I was the master of my own destiny. I was the owner of my own life. And as I walked toward the library to start my day, I felt a sense of peace that I knew would last as long as the stone beneath my feet. I had done it. I had survived. I had won. The invisibility was gone. And in its place was a light that would never go out. I was Elena. And I was home. The echo of the last truck's engine finally died away, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. I stood on the wide stone steps of the porch, the morning sun warming the back of my neck, and looked out over the driveway. The gravel was churned up, a messy record of the frantic departure, but the air was still. I reached out and touched one of the massive white pillars, the cold stone smooth under my fingertips. This was no longer a stage for someone else's performance. It was just a house. It was my house. I felt a sudden, sharp twitch in my left eyelid, a lingering remnant of the night's tension that refused to let go. My body was still braced for a blow that wasn't coming. I was safe. I turned and walked back inside, the heavy oak doors swinging shut with a thud that resonated through my bones. I didn't lock them immediately. I just stood in the foyer, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and the faint, fading ghost of expensive lilies. The house felt massive, a cavernous ribcage of marble and wood that was finally empty of the parasites that had been feeding on it. I walked toward the grand ballroom, my footsteps sounding like gunshots on the polished floor. The catering crew had done a thorough job. The space was stripped bare, the hundreds of gold leaf chairs stacked and gone, the tables dismantled. Only the chandeliers remained, their thousands of crystal drops catching the morning light and throwing fractured rainbows across the empty walls. It was beautiful. It was lonely. I walked to the center of the room, to the exact spot where I had stood with the microphone. I looked up at the ceiling, at the intricate plasterwork I had obsessed over during the renovation. I remembered a winter evening when I was 7 years old, a night when the heat had gone out in our old, drafty apartment. My father had wrapped Claire in 3 blankets and sat her by the small space heater, whispering stories to her to keep her from crying. I had been told to go to bed early to save energy, and I remember lying under a single thin quilt, watching my breath turn to mist in the dark. I wasn't angry that she was warm, I was just confused why I had to be cold. I stayed awake for hours, my toes numb, listening to the low murmur of their voices through the wall. I learned that night that warmth was a finite resource in our family, and I was never the priority. I looked at the vast, heated expanse of the ballroom now. I was finally warmed. I found a small, velvet jewelry box tucked into the corner of the window ledge, likely forgotten in the scramble. I opened it to find a pair of pearl earrings, the kind my mother wore when she wanted to look traditionally elegant. They were modest, understated, and completely fake. I rolled one of the pearls between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the slight graininess of the coating. It was a perfect metaphor for the life she had tried to build, a shimmering surface over a hollow core. I didn't feel the urge to throw them away or crush them. I simply set the box back down on the ledge. They didn't belong to me, but they didn't have power over me anymore either. They were just plastic. I moved to the kitchen, the heart of the house that had been my designated prison just yesterday. The industrial refrigerators were humming a steady, low-frequency tune that felt like a heartbeat. I opened one and found it stocked with the basics I had ordered: sparkling water, fresh greens, and a simple loaf of sourdough. There were no more towers of shrimp cocktail or bottles of vintage champagne taking up space. I made a piece of toast, the sound of the butter knife scraping against the crust filling the quiet room. I sat at the small breakfast nook, the one with a view of the herb garden, and watched a robin pull a worm from the soil. It was a violent, necessary act of survival. I understood the bird. I thought about the office downtown, the glass and steel tower where my real life happened. My assistant had sent a brief message an hour ago, confirming that the press release regarding the change in management of the estate had been picked up by the local business journals. The narrative was being rewritten. My family would be remembered as the temporary caretakers who couldn't keep up, while I would be the silent owner who finally stepped into the light. The social death my mother feared was already halfway complete. I felt a fleeting, sharp pang of something that felt like grief, but when I looked closer, it was just the exhaustion of a long-delayed relief. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a proprietor. I walked up to the master suite, the room my mother had occupied with such territorial pride. The bed was stripped, the mattress bare and white like a blank canvas. The air here still smelled faintly of her aggressive, floral perfume, a scent that always made my throat tighten with a phantom cough. I went to the walk-in closet, which was now a vast, echoing chamber of empty hangers. I saw a single, crumpled silk ribbon on the floor, the blue one Claire had used for her something blue. I picked it up and felt the cheap, slippery texture of the fabric. I remembered the graduation ceremony I had missed because Claire had a panic attack over a broken heel. I had spent the afternoon sitting on the curb outside the auditorium, my cap and gown in a plastic bag, waiting for a ride that never came. I had watched the other graduates laughing with their families, their joy a bright, painful light I couldn't touch. I dropped the blue ribbon into the trash can. The debt was settled. I spent the rest of the morning walking through every room, touching the walls and opening the windows to let the spring air circulate. I wanted the house to breathe. I wanted the smell of them to be gone. By noon, the silence had shifted from heavy to peaceful. It was no longer the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of being alone by choice. There is a profound difference between the two. One is a cage and the other is a kingdom. I was beginning to learn the layout of my kingdom. I sat in the library, the room where the sunlight stayed the longest. I pulled a book from the shelf, a first edition of a Victorian novel I had bought at an auction years ago, but never had the heart to read in this house. I opened to the first page and felt the crisp weight of the paper. I realized then that for the first time in 28 years, no one was going to walk through the door and tell me I was doing something wrong. No one was going to ask me why I wasn't being more useful or why I wasn't more like my sister. The criticism was gone. The expectations were dead. I was just Elena, sitting in a chair, in a house that belonged to me. The sun began its slow descent toward the ridge, casting long, golden shadows across the library floor. I looked at my hands, resting on the open book. They were steady. The skin was pale, the veins a faint blue map of a journey that had finally reached its destination. I thought about the future, the projects I would fund, the people I would hire, the life I would build on my own terms. It wouldn't be a life of loud parties or social posturing. It would be a life of quiet, steady impact. I would be the foundation that didn't crack. I would be the bridge that held. I closed the book and stood up, walking to the large bay window that looked out over the valley. The lights of the town were beginning to twinkle in the distance, small sparks of life in the gathering dusk. I felt a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with the people who shared my DNA. It was a belonging rooted in the soil and the stone and the hard-won truth of my own worth. I reached out and turned the brass latch on the window, locking it for the night. The click was final. The story of the girl in the laundry room was over. The story of the woman who owned the house was just beginning. I walked out of the library and into the hall, my shadow stretching out before me, long and certain. I was home. I was whole. I was enough.